Have you ever felt everything too much, too fast, too deeply, as if the world didn't just happen around you, but through you? That's not weakness. That's the mark of an empath. Empaths don't just hear pain, they absorb it. They don't just see suffering, they feel it in their bones. An empath walks into a room and instantly senses the emotional temperature before a single word is spoken. It's not a skill they learn it, it's an energy they are. This is the gift. To see behind masks, to connect without needing explanations, to hold space in a way that makes others feel seen, known, safe. But with that gift comes a silent trap, and few see it coming until it's too late. Because if you're an empath, you've likely been praised for being kind, caring, always there. But what no one talks about is what it costs you. Being emotionally open without boundaries doesn't make you holy, it makes you vulnerable to emotional erosion. You start saying yes when you mean no. You confuse being needed with being loved. You believe that to help others, you must slowly disappear yourself. But Jung would call this out for what it is: not compassion, but self-abandonment. There's a difference between holding someone and carrying them, between being supportive and being used as a crutch, and many empaths, in their desire to heal others, become the walking wounded themselves. Not because they were weak, but because they never learned that love without boundaries isn't love, it's emotional erosion. Carl Jung warned that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. And for the empath, that fate is often silent burnout, invisible resentment, and a life lived for others until there's nothing left for themselves. So, if you've ever asked yourself, why do I always end up drained? This is why. The gift was never the problem. The problem was thinking you had to bleed to prove it. And that confusion between compassion and self-sacrifice is the first wound an empath must heal. Because if you don't, life will keep offering you people to save until you finally learn it was always you who needed saving first. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And nowhere is that more evident than in the life of an empath. Because while empaths see everything in others, there's one thing they almost always miss themselves: the parts of them that are hidden not in shame, but in silence. The pieces that were taught to be too much: anger, assertiveness, power, even desire. These don't disappear, they just retreat into the shadow. Jung called the shadow the unconscious container of all we disown: our instincts, our impulses, our pain. And empaths, in their quest to be kind, often become its most tragic prisoners. Because in order to stay soft, they push away their fire. In order to stay understanding, they deny their anger. In order to stay good, they exile everything that makes them whole. But what happens to those disowned pieces? They don't die. They just wear new faces in other people. Suddenly, the empath who never gets angry finds herself surrounded by aggressive, manipulative people. The empath who avoids control ends up in controlling relationships. Coincidence? No. It's the mirror. Jung warned that everything we reject within ourselves, we eventually project onto the world. That's why some empaths spend their lives trying to heal others who are simply reflecting back the denied parts of their own psyche. They aren't rescuing someone, they're trying to retrieve their own power, disguised in another, and it never works. Because until you face your shadow, you will keep attracting it. Not because you're broken, but because your soul is trying to wake you up. This is the unseen mirror. Life keeps handing you versions of yourself that you refuse to claim, and the more you resist, the stronger they get. The narcissist, the manipulator, the emotional abuser, they may not be you, but they are carrying the emotions you've been too afraid to feel, and by denying those parts, you give them power. The real healing doesn't happen by avoiding your darkness, it begins the moment you walk into it willingly. So ask yourself, what part of you have you buried to stay lovable? Because that buried part is the key. And if you're brave enough to look into the mirror not to judge, but to integrate, you'll stop absorbing the chaos of others and finally reclaim the storm inside yourself. Because only then does the empath become not just sensitive, but sovereign. There's a quiet tragedy that most empaths never speak of. Not because they're hiding it, but because they can't even tell it's happening. They wake up heavy, tired, anxious. They feel off, but can't explain why. Then they walk into a room, talk to a friend, scroll through a message, and suddenly the pieces click. That heaviness wasn't theirs. That sadness didn't belong to them. It never did. Because empaths don't just care, they merge. Their emotional radar is always on, always scanning, always tuned into the undercurrents of people around them. They don't ask for this. It just happens. Someone nearby is in pain, and before the person can even speak, the empath is already carrying it like their own. But here's the truth: no one teaches empaths. Just because you feel it doesn't mean it's yours. Carl Jung once said, "You meet yourself in the world you create." For empaths, that world becomes a storm of emotional noise. But here's the paradox: while they feel everything around them, they slowly lose sight of their own emotional truth. They start identifying so deeply with others' pain that they forget where they end and the world begins. They're crying, but is it theirs? They're angry, but whose anger is it? Their own feelings vanish beneath the weight of what they've absorbed. And it doesn't stop there. When you keep carrying pain that isn't yours, you start building an identity out of emotional residue. You become the fixer, the feeler, the one who's always there. But while others feel lighter, you start to disappear. Not out of malice, but out of unawareness. No one can protect what they don't realize is fading. This is the danger. Absorbing emotions without filtering them isn't empathy, it's emotional fusion. And when you fuse with everything, you lose the one thing that grounds you, yourself. That's why Jung's words matter here. If you want to stop being overwhelmed by others, you need to stop meeting yourself only in their wounds. You need to start meeting yourself in your own clarity. And that begins with a single, radical act: separating what's yours from what's not. Because your sensitivity is a gift, but only if it leads you back to yourself. It starts slowly. You offer a shoulder, a listening ear. You stay up late for that one friend again. Cancel your plans. Tell yourself, it's just this once. You pour out your time, your care, your silence. And you don't mind because you're a healer, right? That's what you do. You help, you hold, you heal. But somewhere along the way, something shifts. You stop feeling fulfilled and start feeling trapped. This is the quiet moment when the empath, without even noticing, crosses the line from healer to hostage. Because emotional support, when given without limits, becomes emotional servitude. You start bending over backwards for people who never ask how you're doing. You show up again and again, even when it hurts, even when you're drained, because somewhere deep down you fear what will happen if you stop. Will they fall apart? Will they leave? Will they think you're selfish? But Jung warned us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And here's the truth: sometimes the people you're helping aren't healing, they're outsourcing. They're avoiding their own growth by feeding off yours. And you, unknowingly, become the vessel that makes their stagnation comfortable. That's when compassion turns into codependency, when your sense of worth becomes attached to how needed you are, when saying no feels like betrayal, when you carry so much of everyone else that your own life becomes a blur of obligations and guilt. And here's the part that hurts the most sometimes: you're not healing anyone. You're just delaying their growth while destroying your own. You weren't born to be a crutch. You were born to be whole. But wholeness requires boundaries. It demands that you ask, am I helping or enabling? Am I giving or being drained? And most importantly, who am I when no one needs me? Because the real healer doesn't rescue, they reflect. They don't carry others, they hold space for them to rise on their own. The empath who forgets this slowly becomes a prisoner of other people's chaos, calling it love. But real love doesn't chain you to exhaustion. Real love, especially self-love, sets you free. Most empaths think they're safe from the very energies that wound them. They pride themselves on not being like those people, the narcissists, the manipulators, the emotionally cold. But Carl Jung gave us a warning that empaths often forget. What you resist not only persists, but grows in size. and what you don't process possesses. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you spend your life trying to avoid becoming something without actually facing it, you begin to mirror it in disguise. It's called emotional contamination. You get so close to the fire trying to put it out that you don't even notice you've started to smell like smoke. You tell yourself you're nothing like the people who've hurt you. You're not controlling, you're caring, you're not angry, you're patient. You're not manipulative, you're loyal. But watch closely, because beneath the surface, something else is happening. You avoid expressing your needs directly, so you guilt people into doing what you want. You suppress your rage so long that it leaks out in sarcasm, distance, silence. You refuse to assert yourself, so you become passive but quietly resentful. You think you're staying pure. You think you're holding the high ground. But really, you're being infected by the very energy you thought you were avoiding, not because you're weak, but because you never faced it. And anything you don't face, Jung said, becomes part of your shadow. Emotional contamination is what happens when you carry other people's darkness without processing your own. You think you're saving yourself, but all you're doing is storing poison in prettier bottles. And eventually, it spills. You start reacting instead of responding. You start controlling what you can because deep down you feel powerless where it mattered most. And it always begins with resistance. Empaths who don't do their shadow work become walking contradictions, gentle on the outside, but quietly chaotic within. And that chaos builds. It festers. It starts showing up in your relationships, your tone, your body language. You don't mean to hurt anyone, but you do. You don't want control, but you crave safety. And without awareness, you recreate the very patterns that once broke you. The danger isn't in feeling darkness, it's in denying it. Because what you suppress, you don't escape, you inherit. No one ever tells empaths that their greatest danger isn't who they love, it's who they become. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. Like erosion, not explosion. You begin your journey wanting to heal. You hold others, forgive, stay calm, always take the high road. But somewhere along the line your kindness becomes a cage, and you start morphing into the very energy that once cut you. You were once hurt by someone who shut down emotionally. Now you ghost people when you're overwhelmed. You were manipulated into saying yes when you meant no. Now you guilt-trip others into staying close. You swore you'd never control anyone. But now you manage relationships with silence, withdrawal, strategic vulnerability. You don't scream, but you punish in quieter ways. This isn't evil. This isn't failure. This is what Jung called shadow possession. Because when you deny your anger, it doesn't leave, it just changes masks. When you repress your hurt, it doesn't heal, it hardens. And eventually, your emotional body, tired of holding it all, starts using the same tools that once wounded it. Not to harm, but to survive. The empath becomes reactive, cold, cynical. Not because they lost their goodness, but because they never claimed their wholeness. Ask yourself, have you ever been so exhausted from being good that you started resenting those who asked for your kindness? Have you ever snapped and shocked yourself with your own cruelty? Have you ever played small, then resented others for not seeing your worth? That's not just stress. That's your shadow, screaming to be seen. You become what you hate not because you're broken, but because your nervous system is trying to protect you. You mimic what once overpowered you as a form of emotional armor. But Jung taught that healing doesn't come from wearing stronger masks, it comes from removing them, from integrating the shadow, not denying it. So no, this doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you're human. It means your pain has gone unattended for too long, and now it's driving, quietly, subtly, powerfully. The moment you realize this isn't your naturates, your unprocessed painus, the moment you take the wheel back. You were never meant to become your trauma. You were meant to transform it. But you can't transform what you won't face. Somewhere along the line, we were told that to hurt quietly is noble, that to suffer in silence is a sign of strength, that if you love deeply, you should bleed for it. Empaths especially absorbed this not as belief, but as identity. They became the listeners, the forgivers, the peacekeepers. And in doing so, They started to vanish. There's a name for this: emotional martyrdom. And it's not enlightenment, it's erasure. The world romanticizes the empath who always shows up, who never complains, who loves unconditionally, even when it costs them everything. And empaths wear this like a badge of honor. They think that if they endure long enough, it will turn into healing. That if they give enough, they will finally be chosen. That if they hurt privately, they will be seen as good. But Carl Jung saw through this illusion. He taught that wholeness does not come from perfection or purity, it comes from integration. And integration is not about disappearing for others. It's about showing up fully for yourself. You were not born to be a vessel for other people's comfort. You were not put here to hold pain until it breaks you. And yet that's exactly what emotional martyrdom demands, that you abandon your needs, your voice, your truth, and call it love. But that's not love. That's self-abandonment dressed up as virtue. True spiritual growth isn't about smiling through mistreatment. It isn't about staying calm while you're slowly destroyed. It's about claiming your space, speaking your truth, feeling your anger without apology. It's not about being agreeable, it's about being real. And here's the hardest part to admit. Sometimes empaths stay in pain because they've made it their purpose. Because being broken made them feel needed. Because they don't know who they are without the suffering. But suffering isn't your identity. It's a wound that's asking to be healed, not worshipped. So stop glorifying your own disappearance. Stop calling your silence strength. And stop confusing spiritual growth with emotional slavery. Jung knew. Integration is messy, raw, and honest, but it's real. And being real will always heal you more than being good ever could. Empaths are often praised for their calm, their patience, their peacekeeping energy, but no one talks about the cost of that peace, the toll it takes to swallow your anger, to avoid confrontation, to say yes when every part of you is screaming no, because over time, what you repress doesn't dissolve, it mutates. You weren't born without fire, you were taught to put it out. You were conditioned to believe that anger is dangerous, selfish, unfeminine, unspiritual. So you buried it. You tucked it behind compassion. You replaced it with over-explaining, people-pleasing, avoidance. But here's what Jung warned. What you resist not only persists, but grows in size. And the more you resist anger, the more it grows, just not in ways you recognize. It becomes stomach aches, tight chests, sudden exhaustion, bitterness in your voice you didn't know was there, passive aggression in your texts, tears that come too quickly. You sabotage your own boundaries and call it kindness. You sabotage your own joy and call it duty. And all the while, you wonder why peace feels so heavy. This is the cost of chronic resistance. Your inner world becomes a battlefield. Not because you're broken, but because you're holding back emotions that were never meant to be caged. Anger was never your enemy. Confrontation was never violence. No was never selfish. They were boundaries in disguise, guardians of your Suland. You've turned them into exiles. Empaths don't just feel deeply, they suppress deeply. And what doesn't get felt gets stored. In your body, in your sleep, in your relationships, in your silence. Until one day, something small triggers a storm and you surprise even yourself. Not because you're dramatic, but because you've been full for too long. Jung taught that healing begins the moment we bring the unconscious into awareness. So ask yourself, what emotions have I shamed into silence? What truths have I denied in the name of peace? What no have I swallowed that is now eating me alive from the inside out? You are not here to be a storage unit for suppressed emotions. You are here to be whole, and wholeness includes anger. It includes fire. It includes the power to say, enough. Because real peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of truth. We've all heard it. You're such a good person. And if you're an empath, you've probably worn that title like a second skin. You're kind. You're selfless. You never make a scene. You're the one everyone calls when things fall apart. But here's the question no one asks. What's hiding behind all that goodness? Carl Jung believed that the brighter the persona, the darker the shadow. And for empaths, the persona of the good person can become a mask so convincing they start to believe it themselves. But goodness, when built on avoidance, isn't virtue, it's a defense mechanism. Because sometimes, being good is just how you avoid being seen. You keep the peace to avoid conflict. You overgive to avoid abandonment. You stay agreeable because deep down you're afraid that your truth, your anger, your edge, your no-will make people leave. So you sacrifice authenticity on the altar of acceptance. You smile, nod, agree. And slowly, without realizing it, you disappear behind your own performance. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. This goodness often hides not just fear, but control. Because if you're always good, always right, always the martyr, you maintain the illusion that you're above the mess, above the chaos, above the people who lash out or fall apart. It's subtle, but powerful. A quiet sense of superiority masked as selflessness. The nice empath becomes addicted to being liked, needed, admired. But it's not real connection, it's emotional management. You control how others see you by suppressing the parts of yourself that feel dangerous. And over time, you stop being good because you are and start being good because you're afraid not to be. Jung would call this a shadow complex, an unconscious identity that hijacks your life while convincing you it's your virtue. But true healing isn't about being good, it's about being whole. That means letting the mask fall, saying the hard truth, allowing others to be disappointed, even if it means being misunderstood. Because you weren't born to be palatable, you were born to be true, and until you let go of being the good person, you'll never find out who you actually are beneath the performance. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But that's not a quote most empaths want to hear. Because when you spend your life surrounded by toxic people, when you're always the one who listens, forgives, and absorbs, you start to believe that the problem is always them. But what if some of what you call toxicity is actually your own power, reflected back at you? Empaths are deeply attuned to others, yes. But that sensitivity becomes dangerous when they project their unclaimed traits onto the world. You see someone assertive and call them aggressive because you've denied your own voice. You see someone confident and label them narcissistic because you've never learned to take up space without apology. You see someone who sets hard boundaries and feel hurt because you've made people-pleasing your identity. This is projection, when the traits we repress in ourselves appear in others and provoke us not because they're wrong, but because they remind us of what we've buried. The empath who sees red flags everywhere might be carrying a deep fear of their own desires. The one who can't stand arrogance may be terrified of stepping into their own confidence. The one who avoids confrontation and blames others for being too intense may simply be unpracticed in honesty. And that's the blind spot, believing you're only ever the healer, never the one who needs healing. Believing your wounds make you pure, but purity is an illusion. And projection is the soul's way of forcing you to look in the mirror. Jung taught that until we reclaim these lost parts, they will rule us from the shadows. You'll keep calling strength ego, keep calling boundaries cruelty, keep running from the exact traits you need to develop in order to grow. And you'll never be free, only emotionally reactive, always managing, always drained. So, here's the real work. When someone triggers you, don't just ask, "What's wrong with them?" Ask, "What's unloved in me?" Because sometimes the enemy you're fighting is really a teacher in disguise, showing you the parts of yourself that are still waiting to come home. True empathy begins when you stop projecting strength onto others and finally reclaim it as your own. Empaths are masters of open hearts, open ears, open arms. But what they often forget is that staying open without protection doesn't make you wise, it makes you vulnerable to erosion. And eventually, you don't just feel others, you lose yourself in them. That's why boundaries aren't just practical, they're spiritual. Carl Jung believed that the self cannot be realized without a container, something to hold its truth. That's exactly what boundaries are, not walls to shut people out, but sacred containers that protect your energy, your time, your truth. Boundaries are not about being cold, they're about being clear. They are not cruelty, they are clarity. Empaths often resist boundaries because they confuse them with rejection. They fear that saying no means they are failing to love. But you can care deeply without collapsing inward. You can hold space for someone's pain without becoming the space. You can offer love without sacrificing your nervous system to prove it. There is nothing spiritual about self-abandonment. There is nothing divine about letting others trespass your peace just to avoid discomfort. The empath who has no boundaries is not more loving, they are more lost. They've confused proximity with connection, enmeshment with intimacy. But love without boundaries is not love, it's leakage. You teach people how to treat you not by how much you give, but by how well you protect what you keep. Boundaries say, I honor myself first so I can honor you fully. And in that honoring, authenticity is born. So stop fearing the no. Stop believing that love must always mean access. Real love respects your limits. Real connection thrives when it knows where it begins and where it ends. Boundaries are not exits. They are entry points for truth. The moment you claim your boundaries not in anger, but in self-respect, you stop fragmenting, you stop leaking. You begin to live not as an emotional sponge, but as a grounded presence. Because the empath who learns to protect their own energy doesn't love less. They love cleaner, stronger, wiser. They love from wholeness, not depletion. Somewhere along the line, empaths were taught to strive for purity, to be soft, gentle, selfless, spiritual. They were told that love meant giving everything, that anger was dangerous, that desire was shameful, and that true power would make them too much. So they cut themselves into smaller pieces and called it healing. But Carl Jung shattered that illusion. Because healing isn't about becoming more acceptable, it's about becoming more whole. Jungian individuation means integrating everything. You are not just the parts others clap for. Not just the light, the empathy, the forgiveness, but also the shadow, the fire, the truth that rattles cages. It's about saying, I will not hide my power just because it makes others uncomfortable. Empaths often fear their own force, their rage, their depth, their sexuality. Not because these things are wrong, but because they were raised in systems that only celebrated the parts of them that made others feel safe. So they stayed small and called it humility. They stayed silent and called it peace. But that's not peace. That's emotional imprisonment. Wholeness means reclaiming the pieces of yourself you were taught to suppress. The fire in your voice, the power in your no, the hunger in your body, the wildness in your spirit. Not to use them recklessly, but to finally stop apologizing for having them at all. Your rage is not a flaw, it's a compass. Your desire is not shameful, it's a signal. Your assertiveness is not aggression, it's self-respect. The world may call it too much. Jung would call it integration. And here's the paradox: when you stop chasing purity and start claiming your wholeness, you become more authentic, more magnetic, more alive. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. So no more shrinking to fit in. No more quieting your truth so others don't flinch. No more asking for permission to be powerful. You are not here to be palatable. You are here to be complete. And that completeness, that raw, sacred, unapologetic wholeness is the most spiritual thing you'll ever become. There comes a moment, quiet but undeniable, when the empath stops asking, why does this keep happening to me? And starts asking, what am I meant to do with this? That moment marks the birth of the alchemist. Because the true role of the evolved empath is not to carry pain, it's to transform it. Not to absorb energy and wear it like a second skin, but to transmute it into something higher: wisdom, clarity, compassion with boundaries. This is emotional alchemy, and it begins the day you decide you are no longer a sponge, you are a fire. You see, empaths in their unevolved state confuse sensitivity with passivity. They absorb, endure, overfeel, and call it strength. But what Jung would say is this: When you refuse to face your own shadow, you attract pain that forces you to. And that pain, repeated over and over, is not punishment, it's initiation. The victim says, "They keep hurting me." The alchemist says, "This hurt awakened what I needed to heal." This isn't about spiritual bypassing. It's not about excusing abuse or romanticizing trauma. It's about recognizing your power, the power to make meaning from the mess, to rise from what tried to bury you, to stop telling the story of your pain and start telling the story of your rebirth. An alchemist doesn't deny their sensitivity, they refine it. They know how to feel without drowning. They can hold space without disappearing into it. They've stopped waiting to be saved and have become their own sanctuary. You are not here to suffer beautifully. You are here to rise intentionally. You don't need to keep absorbing the world's wounds to prove your worth. You've already earned your place by surviving. Now, it's time to create, to speak, to stand, to take every scar and turn it into sovereignty. This is the shift, from carrying pain to converting it, from victim to alchemist. Empaths are often taught that love means loss, that to care for others, you must give up something of yourself, your time, your energy, your dreams, your peace. But that's not love. That's emotional debt dressed up as devotion. Real love does not demand your disappearance. Carl Jung said, "To confront a person with their own shadow is to show them their light." The same is true for yourself. To reclaim your power, you must first meet the part of you that keeps offering yourself as a sacrifice. The part that believes peace only comes when everyone else is pleased. The part that was trained to make yourself small in exchange for approval, safety, love. But here's the truth. You don't have to lose yourself to love others. You can choose yourself and still be kind. You can say no and still be compassionate. You can hold space for someone's pain without making it your identity. This is what it means to grow beyond survival and step into sovereignty. Because choosing yourself doesn't mean being selfish, it means being true, and truth, unlike performance, is sustainable. It lasts when no one's clapping. It stands when no one understands. It breathes, even when others push back. When you stop sacrificing who you are to keep others comfortable, something radical happens. You stop performing. You start living. No more shape-shifting, no more smiling while you're breaking, no more filtering your truth so it sounds gentle enough to be heard. You are not here to be digestible. You are here to be real. And yes, choosing yourself will make some people uncomfortable. It will confuse those who depended on your silence. It may even hurt those who only loved the version of you that didn't need anything. But that's okay. Because love that demands your erasure is not love. It's a transaction. You're not here to please the room. You're here to be the presence that changes it. So no, you're not selfish for choosing yourself. You're sacred for finally remembering that you were never meant to trade your soul for someone else's comfort. Carl Jung once said, "If you resist your shadow long enough, it will wear your face." And for the empath, this is not metaphor. It is prophecy. Because if you keep swallowing your anger to appear peaceful, it will surface in the tone of your voice. If you keep avoiding your truth to keep others comfortable, it will rise in your body as tension, illness, or anxiety. If you keep denying your boundaries to be seen as good, eventually your kindness will turn to quiet resentment. And then one day, you won't recognize yourself. Not because you changed, but because your shadow finally took the wheel. You'll become reactive when you used to be calm, cold when you used to be warm. You'll keep absorbing everyone else until you disappear into them, until there's nothing left of you but the shape of who others needed you to be. This is Jung's final warning, not to scare you but to wake you. Because the world does not need more self-sacrificing empaths. It needs whole, integrated ones, the ones who have walked through their own shadow and returned with their soul intact. You are not here to dissolve. You are here to stand. And that means making a choice. Do you keep shrinking, performing, pleasing, waiting to be recognized through someone else's eyes? Or do you finally turn inward, face what you've buried, and become undeniably yourself. This isn't a soft awakening, it's a cracking open, a rebirth. The moment where the empath stops carrying the world and starts creating a new one from truth, from wholeness, from self-possession. So, ask yourself now honestly, gently, but without flinching. What part of you have you been hiding in the name of being loved? And are you willing, finally, to love that part back to life? Drop your answer in the comments, not just for others but for you. Let it be your line in the sand, your return, your reclamation. Because your awakening doesn't begin the moment others see you. It begins the moment you choose to finally see yourself. And that choice is now. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.